Vampire Hunter D, Volume 24, Throng of Heretics. Written by Hideyuki Kikuchi. Illustrations by Yoshitaka Amano. Black Easter, Chapter 1, First Part. It had stood there for precisely 300 years. According to the standard map of the frontier drawn up by the Bureau of Geography in the capital, it was located 5 yards above points Z444 and 424. All those years ago, there had been humans who could make use of the nobility's technology. Perhaps they'd worked in one of the nobles' science centers or an engineering plaza. All it knew was that precisely 300 years had passed since it had gone into operation. Even among the descendants of those who built it or positioned it in its present location, there were few who knew of its existence. Regardless, it rounded at its 3rd century of service. Staining the edge of Chain Mountain peaks crimson, the sun sank in the west. Suddenly it knew its task was over. The realization came just as the last remnants of redness vanished behind the mountains. Those long years of service were gone, and longer years of the same that should have been yet to come had disappeared as well. It activated the laser transmitter with which it was equipped, beamed a signal that had been converted to electrical waves to its destination, and awaited the moment of truth. Page break indicated by a small cross. Now, I should like to discuss your work, gentlemen, as well as some relevant background. The hoary-headed, silver-bearded old man said to the 5 men seated before him in wooden chairs, his tone as unsociable as his expression. Since the town hall had burnt down 2 days earlier, the saloon that had once been used as a meeting place had once again been pressed into service, with light flooding its interior. It was an hour past noon. Though the old man had expected some tension from them, 2 of the men merely shifted their upper bodies slightly. But the dauntless demeanor of all was unchanged. Before we do, the big fat man standing to the right of the older man spoke, in a voice that sounded like he had something caught in his throat. The badge of a village sheriff caught the light from the cheap chandelier. I've already told the mayor something about you, but at any rate, I'd like you to introduce yourselves. And saying that, the corpulent figure stroked his badge with plump fingers. Not only did the men not look at the star, they didn't even glance at the lawman. Turning to the aged mayor, the man on the far right practically groaned his introduction. Leica Slopey. Both of his ears were weirdly tapered. His mouth was disturbingly large, and the man's exposed face and hands were oddly hirsute. His long sword had been removed from his belt, and rested against his left arm. Hiki. The second man was terribly thin. So slight of build it looked like a strong breeze might blow him away. He was wrapped in a semi-transparent film reminiscent of the wings of a mayfly. All he had for a weapon was the knife on his belt. Barry Dawn's the name, said the youngest of the 5, who had the gentle face of a woman combined with a ferocious physique. Those who saw his face alone would undoubtedly mistake him for a female. The long sword that rested against his left shoulder was longer than any of the others, and it was in a scabbard that was 90% of his nearly 6'8" stature. They call me the Confessor. On hearing the stocky man's voice, the sheriff looked relieved. Since arriving at the village, he hadn't said a single word. Had his likeness not been in the hunter directory, the lawmen wouldn't have known what to do with him. His weapons were a run-of-the-mill short spear, and a revolver he wore on his right hip. The bag that hung from his other hip undoubtedly contained ammunition. Quake Reston, the last one said, thick and beard-hedged lips forming a smile. Unlike the other four, he had an air of normalcy about him. His eyes as well as his lips were nearly hidden by his scruffy growth of whiskers. He wore a cotton robe that was like a potato sack, and as odd as it may seem, from the waist down it was strung front and back with weights the size of a child's fist, though it hardly seemed like the average person could even move with them on. He was such a mountain of a man it didn't seem as if it would be an issue for him. The lot of you are ranked the greatest vampire hunters in the southern frontier, and the fact that you've been at it for more than a decade is proof enough of that. The average life expectancy of a vampire hunter is 4 years in the eastern frontier, 3.5 in the west, 2 in the north, and in the southern frontier, considered the most brutal of the bunch, it's only 1.5 years. The corpulent sheriff checked on the mare with a sidelong glance. It had been his job to summon the strange collection of men before them. On seeing the mare nod, he was satisfied. Enough about us, just as long as you know what you are getting. Let's get down to business. The man named Laika twisted his lips. Though he brimmed with more wildness than any of them, he was also the most lacking in vigor. Barry Dawn and Quick Reston looked at him from the corners of their eyes and grinned. Outside the weather was sunny. The sheriff said, looking to the mare. The mare nodded. And 5 days ago, the old man began. The regularly scheduled signal from Balsa Hill was interrupted. For the first time in 3 centuries. There have been no transmissions since. It is our opinion the surveillance system that's been sitting up on top of that hill for the last 300 years has been destroyed. Mention of Balsa Hill sent a strange current swirling around the men. A cocktail of 7 parts fight, 2 parts murderous intent. The remaining part they would never admit to. The smallest component, but also the heaviest and most stuporous, fear. No one goes near the hill. Even if they did, the surveillance equipment was built using noble technology. No human should be able to destroy it. I needn't say any more, I suppose. I trust you can see well enough what your job will entail. Here the mayor paused, running a wily gaze over the hunters. Don't tell me some of you are afraid. As if that were their cue, the 5 men rose in unison. The whole room rocked. Looking up at the ceiling, the sheriff mumbled something about an earthquake. The mayor's expression swiftly grew severe, and he said, "I'll be damned. Who knew the southern hunters were all a bunch of cowards?" His scornful words inflicted no harm on the men, crumbling against their garb. "You know, we might be cowards, but we're not stupid," Baradon said with a shrug of his shoulders. "The ruins of Viscount Zeno's castle are at the top of Valza Hill. The Viscount had a wooden stake driven through his heart by the ancestors of your villagers, and his kin sleep their unholy sleep up there. Looking back on it, it's surprising they could have done something so nervy. Legend has it your ancestors delivered poisoned drink to the wedding reception for the Viscount's daughter the night before, then burst in while they were paralyzed and slaughtered the lot. Women, children, servants, didn't matter. Everyone got staked through the heart and beheaded. It's the one instance where history books in the capital don't call it a battle. They label it a massacre. Be that as it may, it was a long time ago," the mayor replied, regaining his composure. "No one really knows the truth. The slipshod work of investigators from the capital is well known. It's my considered opinion that, while they may have been a little out of line, and maybe slightly overreacted, the humans waged a just battle against the nobility." He ran his gaze over the group without trepidation. Here was a prime display of his authority and oratory powers as the community's leader. Suddenly, his eyes opened wide. In those eyes of blue, other red ones glowed. His eyes had met those of the man who called himself the Confessor. As if somewhat drunken, and the mayor slurred his speech as he continued. "The villagers led by my ancestor Dominic Krishkin forced their way into the castle of the Zeno clan. Dominic left a detailed account of that day in his journal. I've read it. As you just said, led by Dominic, the villagers put down nobles weakened by poisoned drink one after another before they could flee to their graves. Apparently their blood pooled an inch and a half deep on the floor of the great hall, but the most fearsome of the bunch, Viscount Zeno's son and his 4 cousins, narrowly escaped harm, fleeing to the crypts beneath the castle to slumber. Fearing their vengeance, our ancestors used mining equipment and vast amounts of explosives to level the castle and block the entrance to the crypts with tens of thousands of tons of rubble. They then set a sensor on top of that to warn us should the 5 slumbering nobles awaken. That was 3 centuries ago. That's a long time. More than enough for our ancestors to pass away and the villagers to forget all about the Zeno clan. But to the nobility to immortals, an hour is probably no different from 3 centuries or 1,000,000 years. They're coming, I'm sure of it. Nobles never forgive human insurrections, particularly the ones like this where they were blindsided and killed so underhandedly. There's no denying it was a slaughter. Dominic wrote in his journal about how the castle was strewn with the heads and limbs of the nobles' children. At that point, the mayor put his hand to his brow, his upper body twisting theatrically. Straightening up again, he took his hand from his forehead and slapped it over his mouth in shock, groaning with disbelief. What was I saying? Well, you just gave us proof it wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. Baradon got a thin grin on his lips. He then looked straight at the confessor and said, That's one weird little talent you've got there. Whatever you do, keep it away from me, alright? The Xeno clan was legendary for their cruelty. Various accounts say his son and those 4 cousins, in particular, were so cold-blooded, even other nobility were afraid of them. If they are fired up for revenge, especially against someone who butchered their kin in such a dastardly way, this won't be any old vengeance, said the man who'd identified himself as Hiki. With every word he said, the film he wore swayed like a mirage. We're not cowards, and we're not idiots either, Baradon reiterated. It's times like this, you just have to say, he who fights and runs away lives to fight another day. They're just too much to handle. Be seeing you, like a Sloopy said, raising one hand lethargically as he headed for the door. The other 4 followed suit. Wait, the mayor shouted, holding out his hand. If you leave now, I'll spread word across the whole frontier that this job scared you off. You'll never work again. Quick Rustin shrugged. Can't work if we're dead either. As the warriors shuffled away, behind them the mayor was so mad he could have stomped his feet. Though he curbed his penury and said, All right then, I'll double your rate. No, triple it. The men didn't halt. Damn it, how about 4 times? Leading the pack, Leica was almost at the door. 5 times? No, make that 10 times. The men stopped dead. This was exactly what people meant when they talked about being in lockstep. The focus of the eyes of both the hunters and the mayor, the sheriff sheepishly inquired, How about it, Mr. Mayor? It was the lawman who had offered them 10 times their normal rate. Knowing there was only one possible answer, the mayor nodded. Fine. 10 times it is. Just one more thing, said the taciturn giant, Quake Reston. If one of us gets killed, I want a share to get divvied up between the survivors. A strange mood swept over the group. They would benefit directly from the death of their colleagues. A simple and delightful economic facet had been added. It came as little surprise that the sheriff glanced over at the mayor. But the old man said nothing, merely nodding. The men noisily clopped back to their seats. From the look of things, these were true professionals. First part, end.